Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, and I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. In another of a series of panels concerning the federal election, we're going to discuss the issues of affordability and the cost of living. This is a potentially central issue of the campaign, and we're pleased to have with us two gentlemen. Franco Terrazzano joins us. He is the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And Elliot Hughes also joins us. He returns. He's at Summa Strategies Canada, which is a public relations firm. Welcome to both of you.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Elliot, maybe I'll just start with you. How important are affordability issues in this election campaign, do you think?
Hugely important. You've seen every party speak about affordability, whether that's through commitments on housing or childcare, or whatever the case is. It's central to every party's platform because it's on the minds of voters. They're facing it every day. COVID has dealt a serious blow to cost of living in the sense of driving it up. We see supply chain issues, which I'm sure we'll get into, but certainly that is having a daily and real impact on Canadians. And there's an expectation from the political parties to respond to that.
Franco, let me ask for your opinion. Obviously, you're with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, so have a handle on this as well. And let me just frame this with a thought of my own, which is that, and this is maybe gleaned from a previous guest I had, Keto Maggie joined us, the head of Main Street Research. And he was noting that some of the polling indicates still that people were saying, well, environment, healthcare, but he's seeing from his polling that affordability issues are really starting to rise up the table in terms of the most important issues. What's your perspective on this, Franco?
Well, yeah, as it should be, right? The cost of living seems to be going up. A lot of people are struggling with that. And now we hear politicians all the time talking about trying to improve affordability. But here's the thing. Politicians shouldn't be talking about the cost of living without mentioning how the government significantly increases the cost of living. Even during the pandemic, even in this last year, the average Canadian family paid about 36% of its budget just to taxes. Now, to put that into context, that's more than what the average family is paying for food, housing, and clothing combined. And not only are we worried about taxes today, but I think we have to be worried about the cost of living and taxes tomorrow. And that has to be tied into all this deficit spending that politicians are doing right now.
Frank, I'll just stick with you. Have you done an analysis of what the major parties have said about affordability?
Well, most of our analysis is actually looking at the deficit spending, right? Because the deficit spending has to always be tied to the cost of living because there is no free lunch when it comes to government spending. At the end of the day, all that money has to come from taxpayers from one way or another. Essentially, we have the NDP proposing taxes here, taxes there, taxes everywhere with no plan or idea how they're going to balance the budget. The Liberals just released their platform today. Under that platform, I don't think the Liberals will ever balance the budget. Now, the Conservatives, they are talking about balancing the budget within a decade, but even that plan lacks some credibility.
So, Elliot Hughes, I'll bounce back to you a little bit. Anything jump out at you from any of the major parties in terms of what they're saying about cost of living and affordability?
Well, I think the housing piece is what particularly jumped out at me. This seems to be one of the key issues for particularly younger voters who are being squeezed out of the housing market due to the costs of getting into it, due to the costs of the lack of new buildings. And so you see each of the main parties, mostly I would say the Conservative and the Liberal parties, putting forward really, really strong housing plans, obviously different, and different tweaks and different approaches, but great to see that that's being taken seriously. And it'll be fascinating to see whether those voters who suggest that this is an incredibly important issue to them actually vote with their feet and see whose platform speaks to their needs the best and sort of puts a ballot or a check mark next to that, or whether or not, we return to some of the more traditional issues, or do issues like the environment and Indigenous issues come back up again? The pandemic, I think, has thrown everything up in the air and impacted us in very different ways. And we're, I think, only at the start of really understanding the the impacts of that. And this election sort of is no different. And it'll be fascinating to watch how those issues play out.
We're just about to go to our first break, so we'll leave it at that. But we'll return with our guests, Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, Elliot Hughes of Summa Strategies. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Franco Terrazzano. He is Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and Elliot Hughes of Summa Strategies Canada. Obviously, we're having a session related to the federal election and related to affordability and cost of living issues. And Franco, I'm going to give the floor to you. Obviously, you've got a particular point of view, being with the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, focused in on those on the issues of deficits and taxes. Maybe sow the needle a little bit for our audience about why you're focused in on that and how it connects to affordability issues for the average person.
Well, you know, as already said, during the pandemic, 36% of the family's budget went just to taxes. But not only taxes today, we have to be concerned about taxes tomorrow. Now, the federal government is already more than $1 trillion in debt, which means that each Canadian is on the hook for about $29,000 just in federal government debt. You add provincial government debt into that, and each Canadian owes about $57,000. Now, I don't know too many people who have tens of thousands of dollars lying around just to pay their politicians' credit card bills. And there's another issue that we need to remember too, and it's intergenerational unfairness, right? Under the Trudeau government status quo, we would not see a balanced budget until 2070. And if that were the case, the debt per person federally would rise to about $67,000 in that year. And it's all tied together. So every time the federal government's spending money, eventually at the end of the day, that has to come from taxpayers' pockets.
Elliot Hughes, it looks like we've got all the major platforms of the three major national parties now. Liberals have released their policies now as well. From your perspective, like there's obviously a lot of promises there. We've mentioned housing. Any others where there's a marked difference in approach? I notice that the federal Liberals costing for their plan is $70 billion over the next several years. Now, the Conservative plan hasn't been costed yet. But they do promise the costing, so it's hard to compare apples with apples, but I'd love to get your point of view on this.
Yeah, I think one of the big pieces is obviously childcare. I think one of the things that the pandemic has shown is that there are cracks in our system. There are cracks in the childcare system across the country that is limiting the full participation of women in the economy, and that's hurting our output, and we need to address that. So each of the two parties have different ways of going about addressing that challenge. You've got the Liberals on the one hand who are looking to set a standard $10 a day daycare approach, similar to the model in Quebec, and you've got Conservatives who are using and relying on that tax credit approach.
Right.
Interestingly enough, I think Aaron O'Toole has run a pretty centrist campaign. If you look at his platform, there's a lot in there for a lot of people. It is not the scary boogeyman conservative platform, say, of how the Liberals would have characterized the Stephen Harper type of platform or an Andrew Scheer. This is Aaron O'Toole's attempt at a big blue tent, trying to attract some of those soft Liberal voters to come over to him. So far, it looks like that's been working. I think what we're going to really see in the last couple of weeks of the campaign is a contrast in approaches, a contrast in sort of who says what and who's been able to deliver on what, and promises that have been made perhaps in the past by some politicians, maybe when they were running for leadership or even when they were prime minister before, and letting voters decide who's got that best plan to take them forward. So it'll be fascinating to watch, some of those issues play out. But I think you need to keep an eye on healthcare, childcare, and housing as those issues that are really going to move some voters. Very good.
Franco, let's turn to you. One of the things that Aaron O'Toole has promised is a GST-free December. Is this a gimmick or is this something that is important?
Well, no, I think it's going to be helpful for many people, right? Who obviously it'd be beneficial to allow them to keep a little bit more money in their pockets to get out there in the community. We've also seen the O'Toole platform announce a bunch of different types of tax credits, a bunch of niche tax credits. Now, I don't want to dismiss any type of policy that will help people keep a little bit more money in their pockets, but what we were hoping to see from the Conservatives was something bigger. We were looking for some broad-based tax relief, right? Broad-based income tax or business tax reduction. So essentially what we're seeing from the Conservatives is, Canadians are hungry for tax relief. We're going to the restaurant. We're looking for steak and potatoes. We're getting some bar pretzels instead.
Well, on that note, we're going to have to take another break. This is a very interesting discussion with Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and Elliot Hughes of Summa Strategies. Stay with us. We're going to be back after these messages with our guests. Thank you for watching. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with our panel discussing affordability and cost of living issues writ large in the federal election campaign. Elliot Hughes, turn to you. Based on my analysis, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, but all three major parties are now talking about taxing the rich, or at least rich corporations, or something in that manner. Does that surprise you that there'd be that kind of consensus on that issue?
No, it doesn't. I think, we've seen inequality worsening over the last number of years. And I think right now there's a big focus on the little guy by each of the parties, on families, on people. And that's both a tactical move when it comes to voting, but I think it's also a reaction to how people are feeling and the impact that the pandemic has had on families, on individuals, whether that's mental health or whatever the case might be. It's easy right now to perhaps beat up on some of the larger companies, on some of the wealthier individuals who have been doing extremely well in the last number of months, whether that's tech companies whose stocks have been skyrocketing, whether it's some of the other folks who, whether it's the big banks, for example, and you saw the Liberal Party put a tax on big banks and insurers on profits above a certain threshold. It is an easy political move to go after some of those big companies at this point. You see all parties doing it, and I would suspect it will only ramp up those sort of attacks and that language against some of those wealthier individuals and companies to ramp up over the next couple of weeks as each of the parties try and go after some of those votes.
Franco, what was your reaction to those taxing proposals?
Oh, it's silly political posturing. I mean, eat the rich might sound like a nice little slogan to spray paint on your skateboard, but at this point, it really is just silly political posturing. When we heard the Liberals announce their increased taxes on bank and insurance companies, well, the way the Trudeau government is spending, it would burn through that cash in less than a day. Right? So we do need to take the debt problem seriously, but for that, we need to see politicians actually rein in their spending. And here's one way where you could actually make stuff more fair for taxpayers. I mean, just stop giving money to businesses, just end the corporate welfare, right? And look at the NDP platform. We're seeing hikes to income taxes, hike to business taxes. They want to put in a wealth tax. They want to put in a so-called excess profits tax. Even with all of those tax hikes, the NDP still have absolutely no idea how they're going to balance their budget. So all of these types of sloganeering is nothing but silly political posturing. And guess what? When these politicians are done getting some cash from the rich and the businesses, they're going to start going after everyday Canadians if they don't find a way to save some money.
Yeah, and I just returning to you, Franco, for a second. One of the instant analyses when the Liberal platform came out was suggesting that for every $3 of new spending, there was only $1 of new taxes proposed. And I'm sure you would say that's $1 too many. But the point being that there's no way even with that to pay for the Liberal promises, and that must concern you.
Oh, it's so concerning. Well, first of all, let's just start with about a year ago, Trudeau promised not to raise taxes, right? So let's just start there. But the second thing that we have to understand is that the Trudeau Liberals platform is promising to put in about $78 billion in new spending. Now, the thing that we have to remember there is that even before the pandemic, in 2018, the federal government was spending all-time highs, and that's even after accounting for inflation and population growth. So what that essentially means is that in 2018, before the pandemic, we were spending more than we did in any single year during World War II, which is absolutely mind-boggling. So with that type of spending before the pandemic, there's no way that these politicians shouldn't be able to actually find some savings in that bloated budget.
I'm going to get to the pandemic probably in our last segment, but Elliot, I want to give you right of reply. And Aaron O'Toole has come up with a plan to get rid of the deficit in 10 years, but only through growth, zero cuts. What's your reaction to that?
My reaction is that is probably not true. I don't see how that can be done. 3% growth, we haven't had 3% growth in years. And I would imagine he is going to have a very hard time of saying and making his way through if he were to become prime minister of not cutting anything. So I think it's a little bit magic math, so to speak. One thing I would say, just to Franco's point, and I understand where you're coming from and who you're representing, Franco, but some of the challenges that we face as society simply haven't been addressed in decades, and whether whether we like it or not, that those cannot continue, and the Liberal government chose to take some of those challenges on, and that's going to cost some money.
And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Franco Terrazzano from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, as well as Elliot Hughes from Summa Strategies Canada. Okay, we're getting into the meat. It's our last segment, so lots to talk about here. Franco, I'm going to give you first right on this one and talk about what Elliot said, that we've got these long-term issues that we've got to deal with. And secondly, Franco, I want you also to answer what I see as a real challenge that we face, that all of a sudden, because of the pandemic, people are looking to the federal government to solve problems to a greater degree than perhaps since World War II. And, where does that leave this kind of the small government people, if you will? So the floor is yours, sir.
Well, a lot to unpack there. I mean, the first thing I guess I would address with Elliot's comments is, well, look, I mean, before the pandemic, we were spending all-time highs. So we shouldn't just think that throwing more tax dollars at a problem is going to solve the problem. If that were the case, then many of these provincial governments would have solved all their problems already, because many of them are big spenders, right? Instead, what we're seeing is now you have the federal government bailing out Newfoundland and Labrador with no strings attached, creating bad precedents for all the other big spending politicians in the other provinces. But look, I mean, many families, many businesses struggled through COVID-19 for the last year or so. Many workers in the private sector lost their job, took pay cuts. Many small businesses, unfortunately, had to close down. But what we saw was a fundamental divide, because we haven't seen the government share in the tough times of the downturn, right? We saw our members of parliament pocket 2 pay raises, not 1, 2 pay raises during COVID-19. We got access to information requests from the federal government showing that there was more than 300,000 federal government employees that received at least a pay raise during this pandemic. So, you know what? I think it's time to stop asking taxpayers for more of our hard-earned money. And it's time to ask the government to do what many Canadians have done and tighten their belts.
Elliot Hughes, thank you, Franco. Elliot Hughes, what do you say about this idea that we've never seen state reliance to this degree outside of wartime? Is there any turning back, do you see?
Not in the near term. I think this is going to continue for a while. And just to be clear, Canada's state of fiscal state of affairs, its balance sheet, even with the impact of the pandemic, is one of the best in the world. And so when we throw figures around and try to scare folks, let's remember that we're doing pretty well compared to other people around the world. Just a point on the federal public service. I think it's important to remember that those programs that were sent out across the country to support businesses, individuals, that was done through a lot of hard work. Tony, you've worked in government before. You know how difficult it is to do things in government, and the government did do a lot of things during the pandemic and got a lot of support out the door. So, while I do appreciate Franco's point around, is it the right time to be giving members of parliament raises during a pandemic? Fair. But I do think public servants, frankly, deserve a tip to the cap from all Canadians in how they conducted themselves and worked around the clock in many instances to deliver really, really important need that, frankly, was the difference between sort of people's lights being kept on or being turned off. And we shouldn't forget that. I know it's easy to slag off on the public service, but we do need to remember that they played an important role in helping people throughout the pandemic.
Franco, we've got about 30 seconds left. What are you expecting from the parties and from the campaign in the next couple of weeks?
Well, what we're expecting is not exactly what we hope. What we want is a credible plan to balance the books. Under the current trajectory of the federal government spending, we're not going to see a balanced budget until 2070, right? That's just under the status quo. And what that would mean is that Canadians will lose out on about $3.8 trillion just to service the government's debt, right? That's just an interest cost, right? That's money that can't go to healthcare, can't go to fixing our roads, can't go into lower taxes, because that money would go to the bond fund managers on Bay Street just to service the debt.
I think you summed it up nicely. Gentlemen, we are out of time, but there's lots of debating to go before this election is over. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Some divergent views there from our two guests about the affordability and the state of finances in Canada. Obviously, these are hot debating items in the federal election campaign as well. Thanks for joining us today to hear their points of view, hopefully allowing you to make your point of view as well. Thanks for watching.